Well, good afternoon. I'm Matt Weiner, the acting chair and vice chair and executive director of the Administrative Conference of the United States, which we just call, as many of you know, ACUS, and probably will do so throughout today's discussion. Welcome to everyone to the sixth and final panel of our forum, Underserved Communities and the Regulatory Process. Before beginning the program today, I'd like to thank all of our moderators and panelists for contributing to the success of this forum. I suspect that federal agencies will rely on it in evaluating their regulatory processes, and I know that ACUS, for its part, will rely on it in its own advisory work on the subject. We will soon have a transcript of all the panel discussions. ACUS will circulate that to our member agencies, and it will also make it available on our website. I'd also like to thank, not least, all of our attendees for joining us for this important conversation. One announcement before we get started: this Wednesday from 1 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time, ACUS will hold another and related forum entitled Enhancing Public Participation in Agency Rulemaking. Please visit our website for additional information. Now, today's panel, titled Expanding on Efforts to Engage with Underserved Communities. Our moderator is Professor Sidney Shapiro, an esteemed public member of ACUS, and the Frank U. Fletcher Chair in Administrative Law and Professor of Law at Wake Forest University Law School. I hope I have your title right, Sid. No one possesses more expertise on our subject than Professor Shapiro. He'll now introduce our panelists and begin our discussion. Sid, Professor Shapiro, I'll turn it over to you and enjoy the discussion.
Good afternoon and welcome everyone. Matt, I don't know if you're going to hang around, but do so for just a second, because I want to note for those who don't know that the Administrative Law section of the American Bar Association has chosen Matt as the 2021 winner of the Mary Lawton Award for Outstanding Government Service. For those of us involved in ACUS, this is simply no surprise at all, because we've been able to witness Matt's wonderful and outstanding contributions to government. So congratulations, Matt.
Well, all of that very unnecessary, Sid, but thank you nonetheless. I very much appreciate it.
You're quite welcome. As you heard, this is the sixth and final panel on how the government can increase the opportunity for underserved communities to participate in the regulatory process. The two most recent panels focused on past and current efforts to accomplish this objective. Today's panel looks at how we might expand those efforts. What new community engagement efforts might establish a more inclusive regulatory process? What else can the government do to increase the participation of marginalized communities? What else can the government do to invite input from those communities that is most helpful to agencies in choosing or implementing regulatory policy? Today's panelists are well situated to talk about and think about those challenges. As you'll see when I introduce them, each one is involved at the intersection of public participation and policy making, and each has experience in attempting to bring the voices of the marginalized into policy making. To kick off today's discussion, I will ask each of the panelists to talk for, say, 4 to 6 minutes about what else the government should and can be doing. We can then build on those comments in a conversation about the challenges I mentioned. While we're doing this, people watching are welcome to ask questions of the panel using the question and answer function in Zoom, and we will take those up at least in the last part of the session, and if not before then. First to offer some remarks is Latrice Hill. who is the National Director of Outreach for the Farm Service Agency at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. She is involved on a day-to-day basis in collaboration work with rural farmers and rural farm organizations. Latrice?
Thanks, Sid. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for that introduction. And Sid, just as you said, it's so very important that we identify new ways that our underserved communities can have that voice when it comes to our policies and rulemaking. The Farm Service Agency has over 2,124 offices. In those offices, we have an outreach coordinator, and at the state level, in the 51 state offices and territory that we cover, we have a state outreach coordinator. Those outreach coordinators are responsible for working with nonprofit organizations, community-based organizations, universities, particularly those that are our land grant institutions, whether they're part of the 1890s, 1994s, or 1862 institutions of higher learning. We work closely with these partners to ensure that they're communicating with the farmers and ranchers and landowners that we serve to have a voice in policymaking. An example would be, let's say an organization such as a policy center. There is a policy center at one of the land grant universities, Alcorn State University, located in Mississippi. They have a socially disadvantaged farmer and rancher policy center. That is a center that came about in the 2018 Farm Bill. It was established specifically to give underserved communities a voice when it comes to policy. These land grant universities work with farmers and ranchers across the country through the Extension Service, through the land grant universities, to get input and feedback from farmers and ranchers on some of the potential programs that we roll out. They provide that voice during Farm Bill time. And as you know, we are approaching a new Farm Bill year. So it's very important that farmers and ranchers provide that input. Personally, what I feel could be done better is to have more engagement from our stakeholder organizations. It's not every day that farmers and ranchers just sit around and read the Federal Register and follow exactly what federal agencies are going to do or what they're proposing. They don't understand that. Basically, all they know is that when they come into our offices, they need programs that work for their farming operations. And when they don't get that, or when those programs don't work, they're not really sure where to turn. This is where Farm Service Agency is really dedicated to working closer with more stakeholder organizations, those boots on the ground that actually work with the farmers and ranchers, who can explain the programs as they are in a format which they understand, and to collect some of those feedbacks and ideas and proposals of the barriers that our underserved face, the challenges they face, and how we can improve those programs. At FSA, we are looking at providing more funding for our stakeholder organizations. We were able to put some funding forth in fiscal year 2021. But we're looking forward to do more of that in this fiscal year 2022 to invest in more stakeholder organizations who can provide that feedback to us, especially in a year of COVID, when a lot of our employees are still not in the offices or not working. We're not able to get on the ground and conduct that day-to-day outreach as we have in the past. And that's really been an obstacle for us. And it's really going to be an obstacle for a lot of our producers. So we're really hoping to rely on some of those stakeholder organizations, Sid. And I'm really curious to hear what some of the others are looking to propose as well.
Thank you, Latrice. Amit Naring is a policy advocate at Public Citizen, and he represents the interests of the thousands of members of Public Citizen, and most of the rest of us, in fact, in regulatory issues. Amit?
All right, great. Thanks, Sid. And many thanks to ACUS for shining a spotlight on one of the most important areas of much needed reform in the rulemaking process. I've watched every one of these excellent panels with great interest in this forum. And now I'm thrilled and honored to be a part of the last panel with such esteemed colleagues. So I want to focus my remarks on Public Citizen's response to the Biden administration's request for comment on how to advance equity and support for underserved communities through the government, including in the rulemaking process. This was a request for information that the Biden administration put out to the public and to stakeholders in May. We were certainly pleased to see the Biden administration signaling that they intend to enhance the voice and influence of underserved communities in the rulemaking process, an area where there is certainly broad agreement about the need for significant reform, but where there has been little action to put in place such reforms. In our comment response, Public Citizen made recommendations for reform that were specific, tangible, and feasible to implement in the short term. Our recommendations were based on 3 principles. First, advancing equity and support for underserved communities should be a government-wide effort involving all agencies across the government. Too often in the past, there has been a false perception that only federal agencies that enforce civil rights and anti-discrimination laws, such as the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission or the Department of Justice, can advance equity for underserved communities. In reality, many other federal agencies, just heard about one example from the Farm Service Agency from Latrice, also take actions or issue regulations that advance equity by meaningfully impacting and benefiting underserved communities. Second, and relatedly, federal agencies need to identify any and all regulations that advance equity for underserved communities. It is critical that federal agencies broaden their view and understanding of how regulation advances equity for underserved communities. That's because regulations that are intended to protect everyone can also advance equity for underserved communities specifically, because those communities are often more vulnerable to the harms that the regulation is designed to prevent. In other words, regulations that protect the public also disproportionately benefit underserved communities. Take, for example, the abundant evidence that underserved communities are disproportionately exposed to air and water pollution, unsafe working conditions, and unfair or abusive financial practices or products. New regulations from the EPA, the Department of Labor, and the CFPB are not only key to protecting the public at large, but also advancing equity for underserved communities. Finally, the Biden administration must prioritize completion of all regulations identified as advancing equity for underserved communities. I don't have to tell this audience how painfully slow the rulemaking process can be, particularly for the most important or economically significant regulations. So there's little time to waste for the Biden administration to complete regulations that advance equity for underserved communities. Now, based on these 3 principles, Public Citizen made the following recommendations. First, all agencies should request evidence and data from the public to determine all of its regulations that advance equity for underserved communities, either directly or indirectly. In particular, agencies should seek out and hear directly from underserved communities on which regulatory protections advance equity by benefiting their communities. This will supplement evidence and data that agencies already have, showing how regulation advances equity in underserved communities, and will allow those communities to have a voice in making sure such regulations are put in place. Second, once agencies have determined which of its regulations advance equity for underserved communities, they should make this information highly visible and accessible to the public, including through use of the Unified Regulatory Agenda. Specifically, OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, should create a separate designation in the Unified Regulatory Agenda for regulations that advance equity for underserved communities. Finally, once agencies have publicly identified all regulations that advance equity for underserved communities, they must prioritize completion of these regulations by meeting any deadlines for completion listed in the Unified Regulatory Agenda. Now, if you're familiar with the Unified Regulatory Agenda, then you know that the timelines that agencies list for completion of proposed and final rules on the agenda are often aspirational and are often missed, unfortunately, by agencies. But OMB can give teeth to those deadlines by monitoring agency compliance with the deadlines they list on the agenda and prompting agencies when those deadlines are missed. We believe these recommendations provide a good foundation for incorporating and advancing equity for underserved communities in the rulemaking process, but it is only a start. Much more must be done through reforms that build off this foundation. For example, identifying and designating a regulation as advancing equity for underserved communities can trigger specialized procedures, such as proactive outreach to such communities during the rulemaking process, and placing more weight on distributional benefits for underserved communities that can't be quantified. Once again, I want to thank ACUS for inviting me to be a part of this forum and look forward to continuing the work to improve the rulemaking process for underserved communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Amit. If I was better coordinated, I would have jumped in sooner. I couldn't get my mute off. Finally, Viviana Westbrook is the state and local advocacy attorney at the Catholic Legal Immigration Network, where she provides strategic and technical support to state and local level immigrant advocates. Viviana?
Thank you so much, Sid. It's my honor to be with you here today and speaking on this very important topic. And as Sid said, I'm a state and local advocacy attorney at Clinic, and that means that I'm supporting Clinic's over 400 affiliates that are spread throughout the 50 states as well as Washington, D.C. Clinic is the largest charitable legal immigration network in the nation. As part of my job, I also support the various Catholic conferences across the country in advocacy endeavors to support immigrant communities in state and local endeavors. But with what I see with what I do, I see the challenges of incorporating underserved communities from two perspectives. One is the attorney who's gathering information and figuring out the needs of what I should be focusing on to advocate for at the state and local level, on behalf of these various groups. And I have to make sure that I'm incorporating all these voices and that I'm not just taking, Clinic's affiliates and the Catholic conferences into consideration, but that I'm also inviting others to the table and making sure that I am getting as many voices as possible. Because the fact is, just from a strategic standpoint, I might formulate what I think is a wonderful plan. And then after I've invested all these resources into it, find out that there is a gaping hole because I didn't do the research and didn't just ask, hey, who's missing from the table? So better to incorporate that early on than to have to rewrite the whole thing in the middle. So I would say that one of the key takeaways from this is to think outside the box. I think oftentimes, we talk about rulemaking, we're looking at the regulatory process, and it's just like, okay, well, here, submit a comment and, follow these steps, but that excludes so many people. A lot of people don't have the legal education or education to read all the legalese. We really want things in plain language that, are easily understood. And sometimes, maybe that'll mean giving resources to other communities. I think one of the things that we saw during COVID is that vaccination efforts were very much from the bottom up. We know that the government, the Biden administration, provided community grants so that people could be providing education and helping, people, especially with immigrants, understand some of the, the concerns, some of the the things that were preventing them from going forward, and actually getting vaccinated. And we're actually partnering then with local clinics and churches and other community-based organizations. And they were all coming together, in this wonderful grassroots effort, and people were going out there and getting vaccinated. And they were doing so with funds, which of course is so important because when you're not a big organization, you don't have someone that's dedicated to doing policy, you're giving of your own time. And normally all these, especially small community-based organizations don't have the funds, don't have the time. And so it's so, so important to compensate them for their time. And the same goes for individuals, for directly impacted individuals who come forward. You really need to have their voices. They're going to be very honest. This is what deeply affects what they need. And so again, providing that stipend, providing childcare is really important to having an effort that is truly inclusive. Something else I would add is that I think we need to rethink how we see diversity. Oftentimes we think we know what diversity is, but we only see diversity from our own standpoint, from our own history. I think it's really important that we understand that just because we get the opinion of one group, that doesn't mean we've covered all of it. That's it. We can check the box. It's not about tokenization. What any group is not a monolith. Identities just intersect in many different ways. It's important that we understand this and don't have a one size fits all. When we're doing these endeavors, that we're having formal outreach, but we're also having informal gatherings, that we're really reaching out and meeting people where they are. And I think that it's so important to communicate, that you engage, and that you build that trust and keep that trust. Partnering with groups that already have that trust is a really good way to do that. And, having follow-up. I think often so much, you invest all this time and effort and energy, and then you don't hear back about what happened. What are the next steps? How was my input, incorporated, or why was it left out? But I think I'll leave it there. There's a lot to say on this topic, but I'm very excited to be here. So thank you.
Thank you all for getting us started, and even more so for staying on time. It's the rare panelists that do that. Very much appreciated. I remind anyone who's listening and viewing, you're welcome to ask questions in the question and answer box. But for the moment, why don't we proceed and perhaps a conversation. So I heard a couple of ideas, and I wonder whether or not they have wider application. So on the one hand, the Farm Service is benefited by having a ground force, so to speak, and it can task that ground force, as we heard, with outreach on policy issues to get input. And that's a little bit rare, I suppose, in the federal government. But one question I have is, since this is about new ideas, thinking outside the box, is that something that Congress ought to fund more widely across the government? In the same regard, we heard an example from Viviana and Latrice of government-funded policy centers, which serve as intermediaries between people who normally don't participate and speak in the process and the government itself. And is that a model that might be expanded on, particularly in the regulatory space, where it's we haven't done anything like that? So let me just any of you jump in, and I'd appreciate your reflections on that.
Well, I definitely agree, especially with what Viviana said. I really liked the idea of how we took the example of COVID and the pandemic, and we saw that grassroots approach. There were so many organizations and faith-based communities received funding to help with that outreach and education. And I think that has worked pretty well. And I think that would be a great idea for policy. Another thing that was mentioned, I think that could be maybe expanded upon, are listening sessions, talking directly with producers, and which we have dabbled with that during this administration. We have had some listening sessions to talk about what are some of the barriers in our programs. But taking that a step forward, I think that also would be a great idea, to have more listening sessions with actual communities, informal conversations, as you mentioned, Viviana. What do you guys think?
No, absolutely. I think, you get so much information when you're in a safe space, when you're somewhere that people know. One of the, I'm not trying to do a plug for clinic, but one of the programs that we have here is called the National Immigrant Empowerment Project. And it's something that just started, a few years ago, where when we launched this, basically we funded 8 affiliates in rural areas. We identified rural areas in need of support. And it's a 4-year project where essentially we're paying for a community organizer, and they go there and they are just speaking directly to the community, and again, grassroots efforts, and they're educating them on advocacy and how to become their own advocates and empowering them, and it's all about education, empowerment. And then we pay a stipend to someone directly from that community, like for instance, in Iowa, we have the meat packers. And so someone who's, a meat packer then becomes like the liaison between the organization and the actual community, and they get paid for their efforts. It's worth their time. And then they do things where they sit together and they have these listening sessions where they talk about what are the issues that we're seeing. How is policy affecting us? Hey, we saw something that's coming up at the state level, federal level. This is going to impact us in XYZ ways. And then, they talk about ways that they can be involved, ways they want to be involved. And then sometimes, they might want to be more involved in a bigger way, and they might elevate that to me. And then I try to, get them to be able to speak directly. But if they don't feel comfortable with that, then I'm the bridge to just convey that message. But I think it's so important, having places where these conversations can take place.
So there's a bit of tension here, right? Some of the models of reaching out, if you will, and educating people are actually by public interest groups like Public Citizen, like Catholic Legal Services. But the aim is advocacy at the end of the day. And on the one hand, if we're to scale that up, there's just not enough public interest organizations with enough money to fund those efforts. So the government really does have to look at establishing policy centers. The model at Alcorn University might be a better one because it's in an academic setting. And so not so much about advocacy, more about education. Back in the day, the 1980s, Emmett will remember this, the Reagan administration took National Legal Services out of the policy advocacy business. The view of the Reagan administration is the government shouldn't pay people to sue the government or advocate against the government. And so legal services was reduced to an important role, but a reduced role of helping people on a more localized level. Emmett, I don't know, is there room for this in the regulatory sphere?
Well, I definitely think so. And certainly some of the outside of the box thinking that's needed and that we're doing along with others like Viviana and Latrice on this panel, is revolving around certain limited models that we have in the federal government that could be expanded to other agencies or across the federal government. One would be a model that actually was just recently instituted at the independent agency, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. In their authorizing legislation, they have authority to stand up something called the Office of Public Participation, but they had not done so for over 40 years. And they just recently decided to use that authority to stand up the office and hire their first director, I think was just confirmed last week or the week before. Now, this office is certainly designed to, through a number of mechanisms, empower voices in the rulemaking process, specifically related to FERC regulation, energy regulation, that simply are not present or active or engaged enough in the rulemaking process. And it gets at some of these issues that those stakeholders face in terms of resource imbalance, in terms of expertise imbalance, and in terms of simply not having a space in which to express their views in a way that actually influences and impacts policymaking. Now, when it comes to when it comes to the issue of it potentially aligning with advocacy interests, I would say that there are already within the government certain stakeholder communities that do receive priority consideration. The one that comes to mind most is the small business community, if you will, that has a whole office called the Office of Advocacy within the Small Business Administration, and a framework for agencies to be taking their views into consideration during the rulemaking process. One could view that as a form of advocacy. I mean, it's in the name of the office, of course, in the Small Business Administration, that's designed to channel their voice. So I think that these types of models, when it comes to engaging stakeholders that are certainly not engaged enough, if at all, underserved communities, this type of model, the model I'm pointing to at the Office of Public Participation, but there are others. There's, for example, the investor advocate at the Securities and Exchange Commission. These are models that I'm hoping the Biden administration is taking a close look at. And in our comment to the Biden administration, we did encourage them to expand upon these models and potentially implement them at other agencies in order to try to enhance the voice of underserved communities when it comes to their regulations.
Thanks. Particularly for those examples. And there's in the states, I don't know how many states I once knew, many of the state utility regulatory boards have public advocates. So these are someone appointed by the state, paid for by the state, to advocate for consumer interests in rate proceedings. So it's not unheard of. And as Amit was reminding us, it might even be more common perhaps than people think. So let me ask this question. As we reach out to these organizations and do a better job of it, whether it's through policy centers or listening sessions, more outreach, how do we obtain the information that would be useful? Someone posted a question to that effect in the question and answer box. And if you have more questions, please do that. Because as Latrice was reminding us early on, people are busy. They're farming, they're earning a living, they're taking care of their kids. And except for the kind of people who are on this panel, they don't read the Federal Register. So assuming we can get out and involve more groups, and assuming whether you have public advocates or not, we still want to hear from people, but we want to get them focused in a way that the information we're getting is actually helpful to agencies. So probably saying, what do you think, is not going to do the trick. What can we do? What else can we do besides what the government might be doing already? Latrice, I know you mentioned you were doing that and you have people doing that. What techniques are you using?
Well, as I mentioned, the stakeholder organizations, a lot of, believe it or not, a lot of people don't trust the government. So when you have stakeholders who are out there and are trusted in their communities, and they're working with those farmers and ranchers every day, in our case, it's going to be farmers and ranchers, they're working with them every day, then they're more comfortable sharing their feedback and suggestions with these stakeholders. Now, when it comes to listening sessions, if it's something where the leadership comes in and they want to hear from farmers and ranchers, they are a little leery about sharing their true feelings. They would rather work with someone who's in the trenches with them, which would be a farming organization who really understands their plight rather than just speaking to us directly. So we do see that stakeholder engagement, it has been pretty successful, but when it comes to underserved communities, there's still a bit of a challenge because finding the right organization that's representative of that community is critical. In farming's very diverse. And so not only are we looking at underserved as far as racial, ethnic, and gender makeup, we're also looking at farming diversity. We want to make sure that small producers or specialty crop producers, their voice is heard just as loud as the row crop producers. So it's a balance in trying to find the exact the right stakeholder to speak. And you have organizations out there who are national and regional in scope. But as Viviana mentioned before, I really think the success is likely going to be at the ground roots level in the local counties. Something that FSA has that I don't think that we've really taken full advantage of are county committees. These committees are made up of farmers who are elected by farmers in the community. They have the voice for farmers and ranchers in that county. However, over the years, it's been hard to get farmers to even participate in the committee elections. So that's been a challenge, but that's something that's already in place that I think really should be revamped, maybe revitalized, maybe some new policies around the county committee. And but that is one vehicle that is there that can help provide feedback directly from farmers as it relates to our programs. And even in hiring, the county committee does the hiring for that county office. So there are some things in place. I just think that maybe the administration should take a look at changing some of the things that haven't been working in the past few years.
So you're sort of blessed with having people on the ground, and you can challenge them to do more and do better in this process. That probably doesn't describe other administrative agencies. And so I hear you that because they don't have this day-to-day or at least closer contact with communities, establishing trust and rapport is going to be part of the challenge. But moving beyond that, is there some way that we ask questions of these communities? Can we formulate types of information that we would like to have from them? Amit, you mentioned that one of the key things that we need to do better of, if we do it at all, is ask for information of the type that the agency will find useful in the rulemaking process. Someone else posted a question that says, well, it's well and good to get information, but we also have to build a record that survives judicial review. So we need to get the information, take it into account, and be able to use it to justify rules that are more equitable. How do we bridge that gap? That's a hard question, I know, but I'm asking it anyway.
I think there is a tension in terms. Well, let me say there is the possibility that meaningful outreach to underserved communities is not going to say enhance the ability for the agency to defend a rule in court. Now, will it detract from the agency's ability to defend it in court? I'm not convinced that would be the case either. Frankly, I think that agencies, frankly, are currently very acutely sensitive to litigation risk when it comes to rulemaking, and are fashioning rules very consciously to survive legal challenges, whether or not that happens in the end. Now, I think that that can take place in parallel to some reforms put in place to, have some meaningful outreach for the first time, frankly, to underserved communities. But you are definitely putting your finger on a big challenge here, which is the lack of data in many instances to show that what we may know, through anecdote or other means, that regulations that are intended to protect the public broadly do disproportionately benefit underserved communities. That's because we simply don't have data on the impact of these regulations along, say, racial or gender or sexual orientation lines. Now, that kind of data is critical, and agencies are making efforts to attempt to get more of that data, but there are challenges that remain, at numerous levels, including through opposition from certain stakeholders that would provide this data to providing it. So I think that we need to, I think that it's not going to be easy to be able to get all of the evidence necessary, but there are lots of areas in which the evidence is already there and in reams. So, going back to the example of the EPA and air and water pollution, we know based on all of the good work in the environmental justice area that EPA has done over decades, that there are disproportionate benefits to environmental regulations to certain underserved communities. We need to act on those. And I think the key in terms of trying to make sure that this is not just a checking the box exercise, which certainly is what would not be a good outcome for this effort. The key way to make sure that doesn't happen is to deliver for those communities and deliver results. And so it would be great to, obviously set up some of the reforms that the Biden administration has signaled that I have talked about in my remarks. But at the end of the day, they're just to start, like I said, and delivering to these underserved communities in the form of strong and effective regulations that protect the public broadly, but particularly underserved communities. That's the key.
Thanks, Emmett, for those two great insights, which I think spoke to comments we had before. First, as we all know, it is true that an agency has to be able to defend its role on the public record, but agencies are motivated by all kinds of reasons, like the White House would like us to do this, that aren't part of the justification, but go into the motivation of the agency. And so it's certainly possible that agencies can get information from marginalized communities that causes them to look for more equitable ways, more equitable rules that are defensible on the information they have to defend them, which would be a good outcome. I also appreciate your comment that the way to build trust, if we can't have it day to day and be out among the communities, is to deliver when we talk to people and across the government, they're able to see some of the results. Viviana, as I understood it, it's sort of part of your job framing and helping your affiliates and people who look to you understand what is, after all, complicated regulatory policy. Are there ways you do that obviously as a public interest group that the government ought to think about?
Well, I think one of the ways that I go about getting the information that I need is that, I'm always explaining like what the impact will be. And again, in plain language, just saying, this is what this, proposed, whatever it is that's being proposed, will impact your life on a day-to-day basis for the longer term. And we talk about that. And then I talk about, like, I want to know, tell me, how is this going to affect you? Because I'm hoping to take this, and then explain whatever agency I'm going to engage with, and, just talk to them about what the process looks like, be very transparent and be like, this is going to take, a while, but ultimately this is what the outcome is. Like, for instance, one of the engagements that I had was on the protected areas memo with DHS, and I got to be part of a stakeholder engagement there. And I went to our affiliates and to other organizations that I knew, and I talked to them. And I already, having practiced, and represented a lot of survivors of violence, I had a good idea of some of the missing areas, but going to all these other groups that I'm a part of and asking them, I found other ones that I was able to incorporate, in a document that we provided to the government. And then, we saw all of this come out, and one of the things I asked, I was like, well, tell me, where are you afraid to go, because of enforcement actions, and they were very candid. They were like, I'm afraid to go, to the bus stop, I'm afraid to go to a domestic violence shelter. I'm afraid to go, to the food pantry. And these are all really important things, but maybe if it's not something that you have to engage with every day, you don't think about. And so it was really, important to get all of those voices, and then be able to elevate that, to the government. And now we're doing a training about, this is what the new policy says. What does this mean for you? What are next steps? And also letting them know, please report any violations that you see of this so that we can continue our endeavors. Because I think sometimes, there's an how they will benefit from that. And, let's just be honest, like people who are really busy, who might be working 2-3 jobs, like they don't need to be sitting there and telling you about like, oh yes, let me answer your questions, which I really don't understand why you're asking me all these questions and taking up my time, but the fact that I can go back and be like, look, we got these changes, we now protected areas cover so much more. Communicate, and like even though time is passing, that they know, oh, we're going to have a training on this, and then we're also going to try to have another engagement with DHS somewhere down the road, and I think that that's something that's
thank you. There's another great insight, right? That it has to be an iterative process, that if you're searching for information, it's not enough to ask one set of questions and then say, okay, thanks, we're out of here. It has to be a series of questions. And maybe that's the way that organizations that don't have a ground force and aren't present to talk to people and follow up, maybe that's a way you can follow up. And again, because you come back, maybe build some trust, but anyway, get useful information. Let me end with this question, which I think will last the rest of our hour. It strikes me that in a way, we're trying to span two types of language here. That those of us who are lawyers and policy advocates, economists, speak what I would call technocratic language. And the rulemaking process, indeed the policy process, is sort of chock full of that technocratic language. The people we'd like to involve, those from marginalized communities and citizens in general, don't speak technocratic language. But that doesn't mean that they don't have valuable insights that would educate all of us and administrative agencies in ways that are useful. It's just a different language. How does the government start to think about spanning that gap? How does the government speak both technocratically to audiences that are technocratic, like policy centers, but how does it speak about impacts and considerations that's non-technocratic? Does that require different people in the government? Does it require different expertise, different understandings of communication? What would have to happen for that to happen?
Well, I'll kick off. I definitely would say that it's going to involve maybe a different set of communicators. Someone who can take that technical legalese speak and convert it to plain language. I don't think that's something that's really been addressed. You know, there is a plain language initiative, or that's supposed to be the focus of federal agencies. But honestly, we're not there yet. There are so many things that are not in plain language. I like that idea. I'm just not really sure how we could get there. We definitely need to break it down into some plain language, and we need to have a way to convey more input rather than just putting out a proposed rule out there, asking for comments. Maybe with each rule, there should be a plain language Q&A or fact sheet that goes along with it, that kind of explains it. Those that are able to have stakeholders on the ground to help amplify and educate that message, they could use these tools. But there needs to be more of an opportunity to understand how the rule is going to impact them. And it's going to be hard to do that unless there are some changes made. Not sure how exactly to do that, but I do agree, we've got to get there.
I definitely fully agree with Latrice that it's not going to be easy. But I think that there's real value in trying to confront this challenge of how to, if I could put it this way, democratize the rulemaking process. Because right now, it's certainly not a democracy, or not the type of democracy that you'd want to set up in a new country that doesn't have a democracy right now. Because there are voices that are louder than others, and typically that has not been, the underserved communities that often are the ones that are most directly impacted by regulation or a lack of regulation. At Public Citizen, that is one of the big, one of our big focuses when it comes to our regulatory policy work, is making sure that we're getting the voice of our members, in front of the agencies, and as incorporated into the rulemaking process as possible. But it's not easy. Certainly, there is an imbalance between the expertise of average members of the public, and then those that are whose job it is basically to engage in this regulatory advocacy on a day-to-day basis. And I think one of the biggest challenges is just convincing, I think, folks, especially in the regulatory policy technocratic world, right, that you're talking about, Sid, that those voices that don't have the technocratic expertise still matter, that their opinion still matters, that what they think about a regulation, even if it's not as informed as the 20-page comment letter from a hired law firm, still has value. Because if we start giving people the impression that unless they can speak the same technocratic speak that we do, their voice is not going to matter, and their opinion is not going to be heard, obviously at that point, then you start losing those folks. And really, there's a lot of promise in terms of the types of reforms we're talking about to incorporate underserved communities. But the danger is that some of those reforms are put in place, but again, there's not follow through. And when folks do try to engage more than they have in the past, they feel that their voice is not heard, and and they feel like it kind of makes it so that they're not interested in engaging in the future. And that's a big downside. We have to build these reforms with a mind towards making them permanent, and again, giving folks real things that, real deliverables that matter in their lives.
Vienna, are you trilingual? Because I know you have a foot in both camps as a technocrat, but also one who speaks directly to many organizations without a lot of technocratic ability.
Oh, yes. Although I will say at this point, so much into plain language that I feel like I'm much more comfortable in plain language. People tell me, "Oh, you're an attorney, but you don't like communicate like an attorney. You're very down to earth." And so I always take that as a compliment, you know. And that's one of the areas that people will be able to understand, you know, what you're saying and engage and feel like they can engage. I just went to the site earlier today to look at some of the like, okay, let's look at the regs. And I was just like, you know, this whole process, like even the introduction to how to submit the comment, you know, like I was like, yeah, you know, let me do this. That sounds great. All of this flowery language, you know, every step of the way. You know, I think someone from a panel before this conference mentioned that not the exception. You know, we need to be used to using it all because, you know, otherwise people just don't understand. And, you know, if you can't even speak the same language, you know, which also is a point about language access, you know, because you have only in English, right? And of course, then that means that you are excluding so many people who also be wanting to, and, you know, and most of the time, things just come to mind. I speak Spanish fluently, and I always get excited when I see that there is Spanish, but then I'm also like, but you know, there's like indigenous languages, Arabic, Haitian, Creole. Like, I'm just like, you guys, you need to think outside, you know. And sometimes people are like, well, you know, if you have an interpreter, you know, and if you have someone who speaks a different language, it's going to take more time and research. Idea that we have to get comfortable with. Yes, it's going to take more time and resources, but that's the only way we're really. And I think that.
Thank you for reminding us that it's not only a matter of two languages, but often a matter of three or more for those citizens who aren't, and others in the country who aren't fluent in English. Another challenge for the government that probably hasn't been adequately addressed. Well, wow, we've come to the end of the hour. Thank you so much, everyone, for what I thought was a really interesting conversation. I know I walked away with several ideas that I didn't have when I walked into the conversation. And hopefully the people who are present in the audience and who watch this later on video will come away with the same advantage of gaining some new information. This is the last panel, as Matt noted at the top. So I want to thank ACUS for organizing these 6 panels on how the government can better engage marginalized communities in regulatory policy making. To my mind, once again, ACUS has demonstrated why it is such an important location for thinking about how to improve the administrative process. Like Amit, I've seen all of the panels, and I don't think there's any doubt that ACUS and the panels have generated new insights about the challenges for engaging marginalized communities. And I know for a fact that ACUS will build on those efforts and will remain engaged in the next months and years. In fact, I'll remind you again, as Matt mentioned at the start of our conversation, they're already going to do that because next Wednesday, December 1st, from 1 to 4, there'll be a forum on enhancing public input in agency rulemaking. And I hope you can attend. And if not, like this session, ACUS has recordings of all its forums for you to view later. So once again, I thank the panelists for their participation today. I thank the audience for joining us, and I'll say good afternoon.